My name is Gerald Murphy, and I'm 71 years old, sitting here in a cramped studio apartment in Minneapolis that I'm renting month to month because I no longer own a house I lived in for 38 years, the car I drove for a decade, or the retirement accounts I spent 45 years building. All because my 3 children decided that my early-stage Alzheimer's diagnosis meant they could immediately divide up my entire life's work among themselves, since I would supposedly forget about it anyway. The cruelest irony is that I'm currently experiencing no memory problems whatsoever, and can remember every single detail how my own family systematically stripped me of everything I owned while telling me it was for my own protection. Yet they treated me as if I was already mentally incompetent when my mind was, and still is perfectly sharp. I'd love to know where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comments below. And if this story moves you, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me shows how a medical diagnosis can become a weapon that family members use to justify stealing from elderly parents before they actually need care or protection. Let me start by telling you about the diagnosis that became the excuse for my family to rob me blind while convincing themselves they were acting in my best interests. In November 2022, I began experiencing occasional memory lapses and moments of confusion that concerned me enough to schedule an appointment with my longtime physician, Dr. Patricia Williams, to discuss whether these symptoms might indicate a serious underlying condition. Dr. Williams referred me to Dr. Michael Chun, a neurologist who specialized in cognitive disorders and dementia-related conditions. After conducting extensive testing, including brain scans, cognitive assessments, and neuropsychological evaluations, Dr. Chun diagnosed me with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, explaining that the condition was still in its initial phases, but would likely progress over time. The diagnosis was devastating and frightening, as I had watched my father struggle with Alzheimer's during his final years and understood the progressive nature of the disease and its ultimate impact on memory, personality, and independence. Dr. Chin explained that while there was no cure, there were medications and lifestyle changes that could potentially slow the progression and help me maintain cognitive function for as long as possible. Dr. Chin was careful to emphasize that early-stage Alzheimer's meant that I still retained most of my cognitive abilities and could continue living independently and making my own decisions for the foreseeable future. He explained that the disease typically progressed slowly and that many people with early-stage Alzheimer's remain functional and autonomous for years after their initial diagnosis. But when I shared the diagnosis with my 3 children, Jennifer, Michael, and Susan, their reactions were immediate and intense, focusing not on my current well-being or the medical recommendations for managing my condition, but on the long-term implications of my eventual cognitive decline and the need to make immediate arrangements for my future care and financial management. Jennifer, my eldest daughter who worked as a financial planner, immediately began discussing the importance of estate planning and the need to transfer my assets to protect them from potential future medical expenses or poor decision-making that might result from cognitive decline. She presented this as urgent financial planning that couldn't be delayed. Michael, my son who worked in real estate, focused on the impracticality of my continuing to live alone in my 3-bedroom house when I would eventually need supervised care. He argued that selling the house immediately would provide me with liquid assets that could be used for future medical expenses while eliminating the burden of property maintenance. Susan, my youngest daughter who worked as a nurse, emphasized the medical aspects of my condition and the importance of ensuring that I had appropriate care arrangements in place before my cognitive function declined to the point where I couldn't make informed decisions about my own needs and preferences. All 3 of my children presented their concerns as loving, practical responses to a serious medical diagnosis, and they seemed genuinely motivated by a desire to ensure that I would be properly cared for as my condition progressed. Their arguments were logical and well-researched, and they appeared to have consulted with professionals about the best approaches to managing my situation. But what became clear over the following weeks was that my children were operating under the assumption that my Alzheimer's diagnosis meant that I was already significantly cognitively impaired, and that they needed to take immediate control of my affairs to protect me from my own poor judgment and decision-making abilities. This assumption was not supported by my actual cognitive function or by the medical recommendations from Dr. Chun, who has specifically stated that I retain the capacity to make my own decisions and should be encouraged to maintain my independence for as long as possible. But my children seem to have decided that the diagnosis itself was sufficient justification for overriding my autonomy. The process of systematically taking control of my life and assets began in December 2022, when my children convinced me to sign power of attorney documents that would allow them to manage my finances and make medical decisions on my behalf if I became unable to do so myself. They presented this as a prudent precaution that would ensure continuity of care if my condition worsened. I agreed to sign the power of attorney documents because they seemed like reasonable safeguards for potential future incapacity, and my children assured me that the documents would only be used if I became unable to manage my own affairs. I trusted their explanations and believed that I was taking responsible steps to prepare for an uncertain future. But within weeks of obtaining the power of attorney, my children began using the documents to make financial decisions on my behalf, claiming that they were acting in my best interests and protecting me from potential mistakes or oversights that might result from my cognitive condition. Jennifer took control of my investment accounts and retirement savings, explaining that professional management was necessary to protect my assets from poor decision-making or potential exploitation by unscrupulous individuals who might take advantage of my cognitive vulnerability. She transferred the accounts to investment firms that she selected and began making decisions about asset allocation and withdrawals. Michael initiated the process of selling my house, arguing that maintaining the property was becoming too burdensome for someone with cognitive impairment, and that the proceeds from the sale would provide me with more liquid resources for future care needs. He listed the house with a real estate agent and began preparing for sale without consulting me about the timing or terms. Susan arranged for me to meet with elder care specialists and toured several assisted living facilities, explaining that it was important to have care arrangements in place before my condition deteriorated to the point where emergency placement would be necessary. She began the application process for several facilities and put me on waiting lists for admission. All of these activities were presented as necessary preparations for my future needs, and my children assured me that they were following professional recommendations and acting in accordance with best practices for managing early-stage Alzheimer's. They claimed that immediate action was essential to ensure that appropriate arrangements would be in place when I needed them. But I was disturbed by the speed and scope of the changes being made to my life, especially since I felt that my cognitive function was stable and that I was still capable of making my own decisions about my living situation, financial management, and care preferences. The aggressive timeline seemed inconsistent with Dr. Chen's prognosis and recommendations. When I expressed concerns about the pace of these changes and my desire to maintain more control over the decision-making process, my children dismissed my objections as evidence of cognitive impairment and poor judgment. They suggested that my resistance to their plans demonstrated that I was not capable of making rational decisions about my own welfare. This circular reasoning was both frustrating and frightening, as it meant that any disagreement with their plans was interpreted as proof that I needed their intervention and protection. My autonomy and preferences were being systematically undermined by the very people who claimed to be acting in my best interests. The sale of my house was completed in February 2023, with Michael handling all the negotiations and paperwork while informing me about the process after decisions had already been made. The proceeds from the sale were deposited into accounts that Jennifer controlled, and I was told that the money would be managed professionally to ensure its preservation for my future care needs. I was moved out of my home of 38 years and into a temporary apartment, while my children searched for appropriate long-term housing options for me. They explained that the apartment was a short-term solution that would provide me with appropriate supervision and support while maintaining some independence. But the apartment was significantly smaller and less comfortable than my house, and I felt displaced and disoriented by the abrupt change in my living situation. I missed my familiar surroundings, my neighbors, and the sense of stability and continuity that my house had provided throughout my adult life. My children also sold my car, explaining that driving was becoming unsafe for someone with cognitive impairment, and that relying on other transportation options would be safer and more appropriate for my condition. They arranged for me to use ride-sharing services and public transportation, claiming that this would provide me with more flexibility and reduce the risks associated with driving. The loss of my car was particularly devastating because it represented my independence and my ability to maintain social connections and participate in community activities. Without my own transportation, I became dependent on my children or expensive ride services for any activities outside of my immediate neighborhood. Within 3 months of my Alzheimer's diagnosis, my children had effectively stripped me of all my major assets and sources of independence, including my house, my car, and control over my financial accounts. They claimed that these changes were necessary preparations for my future needs. But the immediate impact was to leave me financially dependent and socially isolated. The most frustrating aspect of this process was that my cognitive function remained stable throughout this period, and I was fully aware of everything that was happening to me. I could remember every conversation, every decision, and every step in the process of being systematically dispossessed by my own children. When I complained about the pace and scope of the changes being made to my life, my children would point to my Alzheimer's diagnosis as justification for their actions and suggest that my objections were evidence of cognitive impairment that required their protective intervention. But Dr. Chen continued to monitor my condition through regular appointments, and his assessments consistently showed that my cognitive function was stable and that I retained the capacity to make my own decisions about my care and living arrangements. The medical evidence did not support my children's claims that I was unable to manage my own affairs. I began to suspect that my children were using my diagnosis as an excuse to gain control of my assets and to make decisions that served their interests rather than mine. The speed and thoroughness with which they had dismantled my life seemed inconsistent with the gradual progression that Dr. Chun had described. When I attempted to challenge some of their decisions or to reassert control over my own affairs, my children threatened to have me declared legally incompetent and to seek guardianship that would formalize their control over my life and assets. They claimed that my resistance to their plans demonstrated diminished capacity and poor judgment. The threat of guardianship proceedings was terrifying because it would have legally codified my children's control and eliminated any remaining autonomy or decision-making authority that I still possessed. I felt trapped between accepting their management of my life or risking complete legal incapacity through court proceedings. For months, I lived in this state of limbo, financially dependent on my children and subject to their decisions about my living arrangements, medical care, and social activities. I felt like I had been erased as a person and reduced to a medical condition that justified any action my children chose to take. But something unexpected happened 6 months after my diagnosis that would begin to expose the premature and inappropriate nature of my children's actions. Dr. Richard Foster, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations, was contacted by my attorney to conduct an independent assessment of my cognitive function and decision-making capacity. Dr. Foster's evaluation was comprehensive and included cognitive testing, interviews about my daily functioning, and assessment of my understanding of financial and medical decisions. His findings were clear and unambiguous. I retained full capacity to make my own decisions and showed no evidence of cognitive impairment that would justify guardianship or loss of autonomy. Dr. Foster's report contradicted my children's claims about my diminished capacity and provided objective evidence that I was still capable of managing my own affairs despite my Alzheimer's diagnosis. His findings showed that my children had been premature in taking control of my life and assets. Armed with Dr. Foster's assessment, I was able to begin the process of reclaiming control over my life and challenging the decisions that my children had made on my behalf. The legal proceedings were complex and expensive, but they provided a pathway to restoring my autonomy and decision-making authority. The court ultimately ruled that my children had exceeded their authority under the power of attorney documents and had acted prematurely in taking control of my assets and living arrangements. The judge ordered that control of my finances be returned to me and that I be allowed to make my own decisions about my living situation and medical care. More importantly, the legal proceedings exposed the fact that my children had been more motivated by financial considerations than by genuine concern for my welfare. Evidence presented during the hearings showed that they had benefited personally from the sale of my house and the management of my assets. The court also found that my children had misrepresented my cognitive condition and had used my diagnosis as a pretext for gaining control of my assets before I actually needed protection or assistance. Their actions were found to constitute financial elder abuse rather than appropriate care planning. Today, more than a year after my children attempted to rob me using my Alzheimer's diagnosis as justification, I have regained control of my remaining assets and have established new living arrangements that respect my autonomy while providing appropriate support for my actual needs rather than my children's assumptions about my limitations. While I did lose a significant portion of my wealth through the sales and transfers that occurred before I could challenge my children's actions, I have enough resources remaining to live independently and to make my own choices about my care and future planning. My relationship with my children remains severely damaged, as they continue to believe that their actions were justified by my medical condition and that they were acting in my best interest despite the legal findings to the contrary. Working with Dr. Foster and other geriatric specialists, I have developed a realistic plan for managing my Alzheimer's progression that respects my current capacity while preparing for future needs in a way that preserves my autonomy and dignity for as long as possible. The experience taught me that a medical diagnosis should never be used as a justification for stripping someone of their rights and autonomy before they actually need protection, and that family members can sometimes be the greatest threat to an elderly person's independence and well-being. Most importantly, I learned that fighting for your rights and dignity is worthwhile even when facing a progressive disease, and that maintaining control of your own life for as long as possible is essential for preserving your sense of identity and purpose. That's my story. How my family used my early-stage Alzheimer's diagnosis to rob me of everything I owned before I actually developed serious symptoms, but how legal intervention helped me reclaim my autonomy and expose their premature greed. Sometimes the people who claim to be protecting us are actually the ones we need protection from, and sometimes the law provides justice for those who are strong enough to fight for their rights.